If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
It begins not with heroism, but with arrogance, or at least that is how Douglas Bader's critics would later tell it. In 1931, the Royal Air Force glittered with young officers intoxicated by speed, aviation, and the freedom of the sky. Bader was one of the brightest, handsome, fiercely competitive, equally admired and resented. He flew like someone who believed he could bend physics to his will, pushing his Bristol Bulldog fighter through forbidden aerobatics over Woodley Airfield. He was warned repeatedly, regulations existed not to restrain talent, but to keep pilots alive. Bader ignored them. On December 14th, he tried a low-altitude roll, a maneuver that left no forgiveness if mistimed. The fighter snapped downward, its wings striking the ground with the sound like thunder rattling through metal. The impact shattered the aircraft and folded Bader into a twisted wreck. Rescue crews pulled him out unconscious, barely clinging to life. In hospital, doctors laid out the cruel truth. One leg was mangled beyond repair. The other was barely salvageable. Within days, both were gone. At 21, the young star aviator woke to a world that had literally cut his future in half. What followed was what most people would have accepted as the end. His RAF record was closed. His medical board declared him permanently unfit for flight, and he was discharged. The newspapers reported the accident as a cautionary tale, the price of reckless flying. But lying in bed, skeletal, humiliated, and in agony from the phantom torment of missing limbs, Bader refused to surrender to pity. Instead, rage became fuel. With primitive tin prosthetics, he forced himself to walk, then to climb stairs, then, impossibly, to swing a golf club. He learned to fall, to bleed, and to get up again. He cultivated a new persona, disciplined, relentless, emotionally armored. Yet inside, the same hunger that had driven him into the sky burned hotter than ever. The RAF had stamped his file done. Bader silently vowed the opposite. When war finally came to Europe 8 years later, a war that would devour pilots faster than nations could train them, fate twisted. Britain would soon need every man who could fly, even one who had been declared impossible. And so, the catastrophe that should have ended Douglas Bader became the spark that transformed him into something extraordinary. A damaged man who would redefine what airworthy meant, and whose legend began not in triumph, but in the wreckage that was supposed to bury him.
When war erupted in September 1939, Douglas Bader was not a pilot. He was a civilian insurance clerk with prosthetic legs and an amputated career. Yet, the moment he heard the news, the fracture between who he had been and who he had become snapped violently back into focus. Britain needed pilots, thousands of them, and Bader, with typical force of will, saw this as his chance to claw back the thing that had been torn from him. But the RAF did not see opportunity. They saw risk, liability, embarrassment. Applications from disabled veterans were stamped unfit before an officer even read the name. Bader's file still bore the scars of his accident, the court-martial, the discharge, the medical verdict that declared his flying days finished. But he pushed anyway, terrorizing administrators with a persistence bordering on harassment. He wrote letters, demanded evaluations, appealed to superiors, invoked the desperate scale of the war as leverage. At first, every door slammed in his face. But as Hitler's armies clawed through Europe with unimaginable speed, RAF leadership faced a humiliating truth. They needed not just pilots, but experienced pilots. Raw recruits died faster than they could be trained. Skilled veterans, even broken ones, suddenly had value. The breakthrough came through a mixture of luck, friendship, and the kind of political pressure Bader knew how to weaponize. Squadron leader Winky Wright, a respected officer and former flying colleague, decided to gamble his credibility by vouching for him. He arranged medical tests, brutal, humiliating examinations designed to expose weakness. But Bader passed them not through physical ability, but through sheer brutality of will. He lied, cheated, concealed pain, forced his prosthetics to behave like flesh. The RAF board, stunned, reluctantly approved him for limited flying. And then something even more astonishing happened. Once back in a cockpit, Bader flew as though the years of exile had sharpened him rather than diminished him. His prosthetic legs granted one bizarre advantage: no muscle fatigue on long missions. Instructors noted something else. He was fearless, sometimes frighteningly so. Where others hesitated at the thin line between control and chaos, Bader had already lived on the other side of catastrophe. His flight maneuvers were crisp, aggressive, precise. Not the reckless theatrics of youth, but the calculated violence of a man who knew death intimately. By early 1940, he was back in uniform, not as a charity case or experiment, but as a fully operational pilot. The impossible return was complete, and the RAF, once skeptical, now whispered that perhaps only a man who had lost everything could fly without fear of losing anything more. In a world collapsing under Nazi fire, Britain had found a warrior built not by nature, but by disaster.
Douglas Bader did not simply return to flying. He returned as if he had been forged specifically for the brutal new air war over Europe. By 1941, his reputation inside the RAF had mutated into something half myth, half warning. He was no longer just the pilot who overcame amputation. He was the man who flew with the swagger of someone who had already faced death and beaten it on the ground. Commanders, desperate for experienced officers, promoted him rapidly, giving him operational control over squadrons filled with young pilots whose lives would hinge on his decisions. Bader accepted the responsibility with a mixture of pride and impatience, barking orders with the confidence of a man who believed hesitation was lethal. To him, the RAF culture was too restrained, too polite, more bureaucracy than war. He sought to reshape it. He drilled his pilots mercilessly, insisting on aggression, initiative, and cohesion. Attack together, stay together, fight together, he preached. He believed discipline did not mean caution, it meant synchronized ferocity. Under his command, formations stopped flying defensively and began hunting offensively, not avoiding combat, but engineering it. The young men adored him for it, not because he was gentle, but because he was alive, fierce, unshaken. He made them believe they could win. But leadership came with a strange psychological shadow, one few understood. Bader wasn't just fighting Germans. He was fighting the memory of the man he almost became when the RAF abandoned him. Every victory, every downed enemy aircraft felt like a personal vindication, proof that the doctors, boards, and administrators who wrote him off were wrong. That obsession bled into his command style. He pushed his squadron into engagements others would have avoided, defying orders, improvising tactics mid-air, chasing enemy fighters deep into hostile territory. Some senior officers whispered that Bader was reckless, that he treated war like a private duel between himself and fate. But results silenced criticism. His squadron's kill rate rose, morale skyrocketed, and for a brief, blinding moment, RAF leadership began to see him not as a liability, but as the prototype of a new kind of commander, aggressive, charismatic, terrifying to the enemy. Newspapers started whispering his name. Junior pilots treated him like a living legend. Ground crews worked with religious devotion on the aircraft he flew. Bader became the embodiment of the RAF myth, the flawed, stubborn, unstoppable warrior whose defiance made him dangerous not just to the enemy, but to anyone who tried to limit him. He wasn't just leading a squadron, he was rewriting the psychology of British air combat. And as victories accumulated, the man who once fought simply to return now fought to dominate, driven by the conviction that survival was not enough. Survival had to mean supremacy. Only then would history remember him not as a crippled pilot who returned, but as a commander who changed the way war was fought in the skies.
By August 1941, Douglas Bader was no longer merely a squadron commander. He was a combat institution unto himself, an aggressive force of nature whose reputation intimidated even those above him in rank. Mission number 64 began like dozens of others, a bomber escort deep into occupied France, a routine active lethal theater in a summer where RAF and Luftwaffe clashed daily in a contest of endurance and ego. Bader led his wing from the front, as always, flying high, flying fast, daring the Germans to show themselves. For his pilots, it was business as usual. The swaggering commander in his Spitfire, prosthetic legs strapped in, leading with the arrogance of a man who believed fear was a disease you caught from hesitant leaders. The flight progressed uneventfully at first, until radio chatter revealed a formation of German fighters approaching. Bader shifted instantly from escort to hunter mode, ordering his pilots into a dive so aggressive that junior flyers later admitted they didn't know whether to fear the Germans or their own commander more. What followed was not a refined aerial engagement, but a chaotic melee, swirling, fragmented, violent, exactly the kind of battle Bader believed his men had been built for. They scored kills, broke formations, disrupted the intercept. But in the madness of spiral dives, tracer rounds, and split-second maneuvers, Bader vanished from radio contact. For those who had flown with him for months, it was like a lighthouse suddenly going dark. The truth was complicated, and the seconds were catastrophic. A burst of cannon fire, either from a German Bf-109 or the chaotic crossfire of RAF formations, ripped through Bader's aircraft, shattering the tail surfaces and sending the Spitfire into an uncontrollable spin. High command would debate for decades whether he was shot down by the enemy or by his own side. But Bader himself would never assign blame. He felt the aircraft break beneath him, that sickening, unmistakable mechanical death knell, and he knew instantly he would not ride it to the ground. He attempted a bailout at 20,000 feet, the cockpit spinning violently, wind tearing at his limbs. One prosthetic leg became trapped beneath the cockpit frame, refusing to release as the aircraft plunged toward France. In those final seconds, Bader didn't think about heroism, legacy, or destiny. He thought only about survival, in the most literal animal sense. He managed to free himself, ripping loose from the metal cage at the cost of leaving the artificial limb behind. The Spitfire fell away beneath him, and the commander who had flown with defiance and certainty suddenly found himself falling like everyone else, powerless, damaged, human. His parachute opened. he drifted down into enemy territory. His legs, one real and one missing, dangled beneath him like symbols of the contradiction he embodied, fearless and fragile, unstoppable and utterly breakable. The legend didn't die that day, but it fell, violently, into the very hands of the enemy he had spent his life defying.
Douglas Bader landed hard in a French field, disoriented, bruised, and missing one of the artificial legs that had made him famous. German soldiers arrived within minutes, rifles raised, fingers tense on triggers. They had no idea who he was at first, only that a British pilot had fallen from a burning aircraft. But the moment they saw the artificial limb, their posture shifted. It was not pity. German frontline troops had little of that left in 1941, but a kind of stunned recognition, as though they were encountering a legend they had heard rumors of, but never expected to meet in the flesh. Within hours, news traveled up the chain of command. The RAF ace who flew with tin legs had survived and was now in German custody. The Luftwaffe officers who came to interrogate him did not treat him like a prisoner so much as a rival athlete, temporarily defeated but still respected. They asked about his aircraft, about his tactics, but more than anything, about the physical impossibility of his life. How a man with no legs could outfly some of the finest pilots of the war. Bader, who had always embraced competition more than ideology, responded with blunt humor and swagger. He was a prisoner, but he refused to behave like one. One German officer later said that meeting Bader felt less like capturing an enemy and more like shaking hands with an equal. As the days passed, the strange, chivalrous dynamic deepened. The Luftwaffe itself arranged for a new prosthetic leg to be dropped into France, delivered not by courier, but by an RAF aircraft operating under an agreement brokered between opposing commanders. It was an act so absurdly out of step with the brutality of modern war that many soldiers on both sides thought it was a myth. But it happened. British pilots risked their lives to airdrop the artificial limb, and German officers retrieved it, cleaned it, and delivered it to their prisoner. Bader thanked them with the kind of curt sincerity that even hardened veterans smiled, then immediately refused to accept his imprisonment as final. He badgered guards, tested fences, studied routines, planned escape after escape, wearing down the patience of his captors not with violence but with relentless audacity. What baffled the Germans most was not his will to escape, that they understood, but his refusal to hate them. He debated tactics, joked about flying, complimented certain German Luftwaffe units, even expressed grudging admiration for enemy pilots he had fought in the sky. The Germans, for their part, recognized something old-fashioned in him, a knightly arrogance that belonged to an earlier century, before war became industrial, mechanized, impersonal. There were no medals exchanged, no treaties drafted, no alliances forged, but in the cold halls of German captivity, a strange truth emerged. Men who had tried to kill each other hours earlier found themselves bound by a code of honor that the world around them no longer believed in.
Douglas Bader's captivity was never meant to be quiet. From the moment he was medically stabilized, he began studying prison life with the same analytical intensity he once reserved for aerial dogfights. He mapped corridors, memorized guard rotations, noted which officers were strict and which were bored, which locks were old, which windows lacked bars, which sentries smoked, and where the dogs slept. His prosthetic legs, meant to immobilize him, became tools of audacity, enabling him to move faster than guards expected and climb obstacles they assumed impossible for a disabled prisoner. His first escape attempt came swiftly, more an instinct than a plan. Slipping away during a transfer, vanishing into a French village, hobbling deeper into occupied territory with reckless hope. But Bader's fame had preceded him, and locals knew both who he was and the death sentence that collaboration would bring. He was recaptured within days, exhausted, furious, and already planning the next attempt. German officers, initially amused, began to see the problem. They hadn't captured a pilot, they had captured a force of nature trapped inside a metal frame, and that force had no intention of behaving. The Luftwaffe tried persuasion, threats, and appeals to logic. They reminded Bader that escape attempts could get him shot, that Allied airmen were safer in captivity than on the run. None of it mattered. The moment he received his second prosthetic, fully repaired, he attempted another escape, this time with forged papers, civilian clothing, and a route toward unguarded countryside. Again, he made it farther than anyone believed possible. Again, he was eventually caught. The Germans, now less entertained, began referring to him as der unbequeme Gefangene, the inconvenient prisoner. He disrupted morale, encouraged other Allied pilots to test fences, undermined discipline simply by existing. Guards complained that they had to watch him constantly. Officers complained that he embarrassed them. Intelligence personnel complained that interrogations were useless because he answered every question with sarcasm. Even senior Luftwaffe commanders faced a dilemma. Bader was too famous, too admired, too respected to be punished brutally, but too stubborn, too optimistic, and too dangerous to keep in a regular camp. They respected his courage, but they feared his effect on others. Eventually, the Germans reached a conclusion no one had expected. Douglas Bader wasn't a prisoner who needed confinement. He was an idea that needed containment. And the only way to control an idea was to bury it somewhere it could never inspire anyone ever again.
As the more POWs accumulated inside the German camps, the more the conflict seemed to fragment into two parallel wars. One fought with guns and steel, the other fought with maps, tunnels, disguises, and nerve. The officers who found themselves behind barbed wire, many of them veterans of aerial combat or elite ground units, refused to accept captivity as a permanent condition. They saw escape as duty, resistance, and sport all at once. Camps like Stalag Luft 3, Oflag 4C, and Colditz became laboratories of ingenuity, populated by men who measured their days not by meals or roll calls, but by the progress of clandestine digging, the forging of false documents, and the quiet choreography of distractions, timed to the second. In this world, hierarchy dissolved. Engineers, thieves, linguists, and magicians of improvisation rose to prominence, crafting from scrap metal and stolen blankets a delicate infrastructure of rebellion. Their audience wasn't just themselves, it was Allied intelligence who encouraged escape attempts as both moral victory and strategic disruption. And looming over every plan was the cold calculus of consequence. Success meant freedom, failure meant interrogation, solitary confinement, or, increasingly, execution. German authorities, at first mildly irritated, soon recognized that they were not housing defeated men, but hyper-competitive predators deprived of mobility. What began as harmless attempts by restless prisoners evolved into organized escape industries with dedicated supply chains and covert communication networks. Tunnels stretched for hundreds of meters, stabilized with stolen bed slats, vented with improvised pumps, illuminated with handmade lamps wired into the camp grid. Teams rehearsed cover stories the way infantry rehearsed assaults, names, addresses, accents, committed to muscle memory. But the Germans adapted in turn. The Gestapo and Luftwaffe security services responded with dogs, acoustic sensors, random camp transfers, and a bureaucracy of vigilance refined through study and bitter experience. Behind the wire, the contest grew almost theatrical, a rivalry where both sides, prisoners and guards, respected skill, despised incompetence, and feared escalation. Escapes became demonstrations of identity, statements that a prisoner could lose everything except the right to outthink an empire. And when news reached the camps that successful evaders made it home, celebrated as heroes, the stakes only intensified. Every attempt, no matter how small, felt like an act that could tilt the war, an assertion that captivity was not surrender, and that even in cages, soldiers could still fight.
Colditz Castle, looming over the Saxon town below like a medieval warning, was not designed for ordinary prisoners. It was designed to contain men who refused containment. The Germans filled it with the most persistent, most brilliant, and most infuriating escape artists captured during the war. Serial tunnelers, expert forgers, multilingual improvisers, and officers whose reputations preceded them like criminal dossiers. Here, escape was not merely discouraged, it was intended to be erased from possibility. High walls, cliffside drops, armed patrols, and the forbidding stone labyrinth of the castle itself created an environment that seemed to reject human ingenuity. But the men inside did not interpret Colditz as a final destination. They interpreted it as an invitation. Some saw it as a crucible of willpower, others as a game board where the rules of conventional warfare no longer applied. The officers who arrived were greeted with the legends of those who tried before them, stories of failed jumps, unfinished tunnels, and audacious stunts that had become camp folklore. The psychological effect was paradoxical. Instead of crushing morale, Colditz cultivated a belief that impossibility was simply a challenge waiting for someone to break it. Inside, the prisoners built a culture that resembled an underground university of subversion. Workshops, cover identities, hidden storage caches, and escape committees formed with the professionalism of a corporate board. Activities that anywhere else would seem insane were routine. Designing gliders, tailoring civilian suits, and fabricating tools from soup tins, bed frames, and piano wire. Men scouted the castle like archaeologists, mapping cracks in walls, measuring guard routines, and testing the acoustics of every room to predict whether digging would echo. Not every attempt ended in triumph. Many ended in solitary confinement, hospital beds, or quiet despair. Yet the failures produced something more powerful than success, a body of knowledge that future escapees used as a blueprint. And surprisingly, the Germans, military officers running the camp, not the political police, often regarded their captives with a mixture of frustration and respect. They were custodians of dangerous men,
but also unwilling participants in a strange intellectual duel. Colditz became a paradoxical theater where brutality coexisted with grudging admiration, where a prison designed to halt the unstoppable instead revealed the boundless capacity of human resolve. In the end, its legend was not built on one spectacular breakout, but on the simple fact that within its walls, defeat never became identity, and captivity never became consent.